Namaskar and good afternoon. This is Kanchan Banerjee, and I am the Managing Director and co-founder of the Boston Center of Excellence for Health and Human Development. Uh, and many of you already know about the Boston Center of Excellence that we have started last year. And just to give a quick introduction, I have a slide here. I'm sharing my screen. I hope you can see it. If you don't see it, if you have joined through phone, I am going to read it for you. Why Boston Center of Excellence? We have started this with a vision to improve health and wellness in terms of disease outcomes in Western world by making yoga and Ayurveda core constituent of integral medicine in the US and worldwide. And our mission statement says, bringing together researchers, subject matter experts, practitioners, institutions, and supporters to foster research program development, education, training program, and promotion of yoga and Ayurveda. And I'm going to go off from video, and I'm going to before we start our program today, again, welcome to all of you on behalf of the Boston Center of Excellence. Before we start our program, I wanted to take a couple of minutes to present a little bit of history to you. Back in the 1850s, there was a strong movement in America, which started in Boston. It was called the Transcendental Movement. In a way, it was preparing the ground for much more to come shortly after the departure of both Emerson and Thoreau, who actually were leading this transcendentalist movement. And Emerson died in 1862 and Thoreau died in 1882. Within few years, in 1893, came Swami Vivekananda in the US and formally introduced yoga as a science of the inner self to the whole world. He wrote several of his important books, including the Raj Yoga and translations of Patanjali Yoga Sutras, mostly in New York. As most of you know, today in America, every town and city have yoga studios or schools. There are almost 20,000 yoga centers, and number of teachers are over 60,000. Number of practitioners are somewhere between 30 to 35 million people, and it's rapidly growing. And as you know, today, the January 12th, is the birthday of the same Swami Vivekananda who introduced yoga to us in the West. What could be a better occasion for us to launch this seminar series with our tribute to Swami Vivekananda's life and work? Boston Center of Excellence for Health and Human Development, or BoCE, is inspired by him and working for the betterment of the world in all spheres of life, including health and wellness. So with that tribute, I would now go ahead and introduce our very special guest speaker. And one point I wanted to make, you might be wondering why you are muted. There are over 50 people participating right now. If you all start speaking, it will be chaos. So everybody is muted. You'll be able to send your questions through the questions in the panel you will see. And you can send it or send an email to my email address, which is forkanchan@gmail.com. And I will read it out to Dr. Fricchione, and then he will answer. So let's quickly introduce. It is my honor, great honor, and really privileged to introduce Dr. Greg L Fricchione. Is the Associate Chief of Psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital, or MGH, and the Director of the Benson Henry Institute for Mind-Body Medicine, and also the Chester M. Pierce Division of Global Psychiatry at Mass General Hospital. He also serves as the Gary Gottlieb, MD, Partners Healthcare Chair in Global Community Mental Health. He is Director Emeritus of both the Division of Psychiatry and Medicine and in the Psychosomatic Medicine Fellowship at the Mass General Hospital. He has been a member of the faculty of Harvard Medical School since 1993 for long years. He is the Harvard Medical School Mind Body Medicine Professor of Psychiatry. He has received his MD from New York University School of Medicine in 1978 and completed his postgraduate training in psychiatry at NYU Bellevue and in psychosomatic medicine at Mass General. He's board certified in psychiatry and has had added qualification in psychosomatic medicine and geriatric psychiatry. He has taught in the medical schools at New York University, the State University of New York at Stony Brook, um, and it's a quite a accomplished but very short bio. University of Auckland in New Zealand, and at Emory University as well as Harvard Medical School. He has authored several books and over 150 peer-reviewed journal articles, and is a co-author of the Mass General Handbook on General Hospital Psychiatry, from psychopathology to neurobiology, the heart-mind connection, and compassion and healing in medicine and society, on the nature of and uses of attachment solutions to separation challenges, and also the science of stress, living under pressure. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Fricchione to talk about today's topic, and which is um, mind-body medicine, the crisis of non-communicable diseases, and the role of yoga in public health. Dr. Fricchione, welcome.
Thank you, Kanchan. Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. This is truly an honor to be with you today, especially since I have learned that it is the Swami Vivekananda's birthday. Let me get started here.
Slideshow.
Yeah.
From the beginning.
Yeah, let's see here.
Far left.
There we go. Okay, I hope you can see these. Oh, you know, I was reading about the Swami, and it was quite interesting to me. He really made his mark back in, I think, 1893, when he gave a stirring talk at the Parliament of World Religions meeting in Chicago. And I guess 2018 was the 125th anniversary. But prior to that talk, he was invited to stay with the professor of Greek at Harvard, John Henry Wright, a rather famous
webinar. You have entered as an attendee in listen-only mode.
So hold on a second.
Okay. Who became dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, and he wrote that. Let's see here. I'm having trouble with the. Okay, he wrote that here is a man who is more learned than all the learned professors put together at Harvard. I think he really helped people understand that there were many, many different ways to achieve a sense of connection with the spirit, with the universal spirit. And I think that's why people were drawn to Swami Vivekananda's message. And it certainly was a healing message. Now, I have to move this. There we go. Mind-body medicine is a subset of general medicine, and it recognizes that the brain and body are one, and it uses the evidence-based effects of thoughts, beliefs, and emotions to try to promote physical and mental health. And it tries to promote health and healing in a heterogeneous way. It uses relaxation exercises, meditative and contemplative approaches, biofeedback, guided imagery, hypnosis, and yes, yoga and Tai Chi and Qigong to try to establish a healthy harmony, a homeostasis for the mind and body. Now, there are three hypotheses we use at our institute. The first is that the environment is biology, and so the mind and body form a unity. You really cannot separate mind and body. And what do I mean by that? You're listening to my words right now, and that auditory messaging is being transduced into biochemical and electrochemical energy in your mind, in your brain. So there's no distance between our experience and our biology.
Dr. Fricchione, sorry to interrupt. We cannot see your screen, so you have to
Oh, is that right?
share your screen. There should be an option.
Show.
Share. Yeah. Show your screen. Yep, we can see it now.
Okay, good. Okay. Yeah, the problem is that it's hard for me to see my slides when I share the screen. That's interesting. Okay, and the second hypothesis is that psychosocial stress, the stress we feel in our daily lives, will lead to cellular stress. It's something we call oxidative stress, and it will put a burden on the organelles in each of our cells, the energy drivers of our cells, the mitochondria. And something called the mitochondrial reserve capacity may be reduced when we're under overwhelming or chronic undue stress. And we'll talk more about that. And then it's that cellular oxidative stress, that mitochondrial strain, if you will, that's what leads to our disease vulnerability. So we all have certain vulnerabilities that we need to deal with. And if we don't pay attention to the burden of stress in our lives, that disease vulnerability may be uncovered and lead to the stress-related chronic diseases that we're going to talk about. So stress is really what the brain does to itself and other parts of the body when a stressor is perceived as a separation threat or challenge, or even sometimes as an attachment opportunity. And I hope that becomes clear to you as we discuss this. This is an argument from the point of view of evolutionary biology and the evolutionary biology of the brain, as I'll hopefully make clear to you in a few moments. Now, all of us, you know, we spent the first 9 months of our lives in our mother's womb. And then the first stressful event, if you will, was when we were born. And of course, that's a physical separation stress, isn't it? So, and what we know when a baby is born, that it is accompanied by an overwhelming physiological stress response. The sympathetic nervous system jumps up. And of course, this is healthy because it opens up the baby's lungs and gets the heart moving and so on. But that's very symbolic, because that's first stress, a physical separation stress, is reproduced over and over and over in our lives. And this becomes an important part of the stress story for every human being. Now, there are three main conduits that lead to the effects of our stress experience on our brains and our bodies. And those three conduits are the sympathetic nervous system, what I just mentioned. And the first part of the sympathetic stress response really takes place in the adrenal medulla with the epinephrine surge that occurs when you feel stressed or threatened. But there also is the sympathetic nervous system itself. And that flows from messaging that comes through our brain, through the locus ceruleus, which is a group of cell bodies in the upper brainstem that produce the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, and the connection there with the amygdala, which you'll hear a lot about today. And the amygdala will send that message of threat or challenge to the lateral hypothalamus. And before you know it, your sympathetic nervous system is ignited and it overwhelms the parasympathetic nervous system, which has evolved to try to dampen our stress response. So the sympathetic nervous system is one major conduit of the stress response. But then another part of the hypothalamus, the paraventricular nucleus, is also engaged when we feel stressed. And it produces a hormone called corticotropin-releasing hormone, which messages the pituitary, which produces adrenocorticotropic hormone, which then travels to another part of the adrenal gland called the adrenal cortex to pour out a major stress hormone we call cortisol. And then there's another axis of stress that is increasingly important in our understanding of pathogenicity, and that is the inflammatory response. And here we've known for quite some time that when the sympathetic nervous system is engaged, that the peripheral inflammatory system, which is headed up by the macrophage, an activated monocyte circulating in our system, that will become excited when we are in the throes of a stress response. And those macrophages will produce these protein cytokines, these pro-inflammatory cytokines, IL-1, IL-6, and a whole host of pro-inflammatory cytokines. And as we'll see, that performs a very important survival action for us. However, too much inflammatory response can be very damaging to our health, and we'll talk about that. Now, the new information over the last 5 to 10 years is that psychosocial stress can, in and of itself, cause an inflammation in brain tissue. Okay, so this is not indirectly peripheral inflammation sending messengers through the blood-brain barrier to the brain and causing inflammation secondarily. No, psychosocial stress can, in and of itself, energize, stimulate, activate the brain's own macrophages. We call them microglial cells. And those microglial cells will produce an inflammatory response in the brain. So you can see how this becomes a very, very important part of the mind-body medicine story. And we'll talk more about that. Now, I mentioned that stress can be thought of as a separation challenge. What do I mean by that? Well, this slide shows a very famous study called the Holmes-Ray Life Stress Unit Scale Study. And these researchers, they were psychologists at Harvard, did a famous study in Seattle. They looked at normals in the population, and they asked them what was most stressful in their lives. And then they gave these answers of values. And as you see here, fully 8 of the first 11 on the list are separation events. So people find death of a spouse or a life partner to be the most stressful experience. They find divorce and marital separation to be right behind it in terms of stress. So this tells us something, doesn't it? It forms the epidemiological truth about what human beings find stressful. Now, where does that come from? So I want to show you this slide of the human brain. And I want to point out to you several important areas that really illuminate for us why stress is so important for medicine in general. So I talked to you about the amygdala. You see that this pink area here. This is actually on the medial side in the middle of the brain, on the surface of the temporal lobe. A very ancient structure. All vertebrates have amygdala. Why? Because the amygdala is essential for the survival of the organism. The amygdala is the fear conditioning center. It is that part of your brain which is a sentinel that is scanning your internal and external environment to look for threats, to look for anomalies, to look for surprises that may threaten you and lead to your separation from everything that you hold dear and from everything that's required for your health and well-being. The amygdala is hypercharged with excitatory neurons that produce the excitatory neurotransmitter called glutamate. And glutamate then flows out of axons in the amygdala to bathe most parts of the brain. Now, another important area of the human brain, and it's also ancient, is the hippocampus. And all vertebrates have hippocampi. And the hippocampus, we think of it nowadays as being our memory site, memory central, if you will. Memories get, if they're important enough, if they're novel enough, they will get stored through the hippocampus and stored in association cortices in other areas of the brain. But the hippocampus had another ancient role. It inhibited the amygdala, and it still does that today. But as we evolved, it became clear that we needed more control, a greater capacity to tell the amygdala to slow down and to feel safe. And this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is here, evolved for many different reasons. It is the most advanced part of our human brain. It is responsible for many of the things we might say make us human. But one important role it plays through dense connections back to the amygdala is to inhibit amygdala tone. And we'll show you how that's done. And the medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate, including the anterior cingulate and the mid-cingulate, which used to be called the dorsal anterior cingulate, are key recent parts of the brain that evolved to dampen amygdala tone. And when we're feeling healthy and connected and safe, we dampen the amygdala tone. The hypothalamus and pituitary get the message that we're safe, and we then can turn down the stress response system, sympathetic nervous system, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and inflammatory response. Okay? So this gives you a summation of the ball field, the pitch on which these chronic stress-related diseases take place. Now, this slide is meant to show you that there's an inverted U-shaped curve. And I want to make a very important point. Stress can sometimes have the connotation of negativity, as if all stress is bad. Well, that's not true. Being alive requires stress. When you wake up in the morning, your cortisol bumps because your body realizes that waking up is a stressor, and you're going to have to get ready for other stressful things in your daily life. So the left side of that inverted U-shaped curve, this amount of stress actually is healthy. It will do things like improve synaptic transmission in your neurons. It will improve this process we call long-term potentiation. It will help you set down memories, in other words. It will improve your ability to learn. And you'll see, if you looked at the histology of the brain under these minor stress levels, you'll see arborization, dendritic sites are improved, etc. But too much stress means you're going to go over the top, and then your synapses start to perform more poorly. Long-term potentiation is not as robust. You're going to start to have dendritic atrophy, and this gets played out, it gets reflected in a reduction in your resilience to stress. And so you potentiate your vulnerability to illness when there are increasing degrees of stress and chronicity of stress. And if, God forbid, you are the victim of a very traumatic event, or you're chronically, severely stressed out, you can expect there to be structural and functional changes in your brain. And so your hippocampus will have reduced volume, reversible dendritic atrophy. And the hippocampus, as some of you may know, is that one area of the brain in humans and primates where the hippocampus can make new brain cells. But if you're the victim of a traumatic stress or chronic stress, chances are you're going to have a reduced ability to make new brain cells in your hippocampus. At the same time, your amygdala, it's like it's been working out in the gym. It's stronger than ever. It is producing more and more senses of fear and anxiety, and is making you more prone to stress. And at the same time, that medial prefrontal cortex I told you about is having dendritic atrophy and spine loss, and is hypo-responsive and can no longer do the best it can to reduce amygdalar tone and to reduce the stress response. Now, a couple of things I won't spend too much time on in the interest of time, but when we take an evolutionary point of view to try to understand the biology here, what we know is that we evolved from lower vertebrates in a very, very dirty environment, a hostile microbial environment, if you will. And so natural selection, obviously, is going to provide a survival advantage to those organisms that had a hair trigger inflammatory response. Makes sense, right? So that bias that came to us through natural selection and evolution of genetic evolution has given to us modern human beings this inflammatory bias. Now, that creates some challenges for us. And this is what I mean. When you understand evolutionary biology, it makes sense that you as an organism are built to tolerate a huge number of false positives. And what do I mean by that? I mean that you are going to mount an inflammatory response at the drop of a hat. You are going to mount an inflammatory response even if you don't need to. But something has given you a sense of threat. Something has been sensed by your sentinel inflammatory cells as a potential threat. And before you know it, you're in the midst of an acute inflammatory response, producing a whole lot of pro-inflammatory cytokine material. And you can understand that that actually preserved us through those times when we had a very hostile microbial environment. However, we can tolerate those acute inflammatory episodes if we have a robust way of turning it off. Because at the end of the day, it's very expensive to us. It's expensive to our mitochondria. I mentioned those amazing cell organelles earlier. Our mitochondria, if we are frequently in the middle of an inflammatory response, have to work overtime, gobbling up lots of glucose and oxygen in order to produce those pro-inflammatory cytokine proteins. That puts us at risk for these stress-related chronic illnesses, and it's called oxidative stress. At the same time, we evolved a social attachment bias, and we'll talk more about this. But we also, because of how we evolved, require social attachment to survive. So that becomes a source of an acute stress response. Again, we tolerate a lot of false positives. Things worry us socially that are really not realistic threats. We have to find ways of turning off those threats, or else we'll be, again, exerting a lot of energy needlessly and putting ourselves at risk for illness. And the point of this slide is that the major health challenges all over the world in the early in the 20th century were infectious diseases. In the United States, for example, 800 per 100,000 people died from infectious diseases. But in the early 20th century, we chlorinated water. Penicillin was discovered. Vaccines became more and more important. So the death rates dropped more than 90% in the 20th century. So the point here is that in high income and middle income countries, infectious diseases, even if we're talking about HIV or Ebola or SARS or Zika, they are not the major healthcare challenge that the world faces any longer. The major health challenge in our century, the 21st century, is this whole area of stress-related chronic non-communicable diseases. This is what causes the greatest global burden, and these non-communicable diseases cause greater than 60% of the world's deaths as well. Now, there's a point to be made, there's an argument to be made that even these so-called non-communicable diseases are really communicable in the sense that they seem to travel along social networks. So people who are obese seem to hang out together. Drug abuse seems to be part of a social network, and so on. And the body recognizes the challenge, the microbial challenge, as well as the social attachment challenge, the separation challenge, in similar ways. Your body will respond to an infectious agent with an inflammatory response. And the macrophages and the microglial cells will be activated. But your body will respond to a social separation stressor in the same way, with an activated inflammatory response. So this is essential information nowadays in terms of mind-body medicine, but also medicine in general. So let's go back and try to understand the brain in a little more depth. The brain really, simply speaking, is a biological organ that through evolutionary time assumed the role of the job description of every living thing. Now, what do I mean by that? It might sound strange to your ears, but what does that mean? When you think about any living organism that you can think of, whether you're talking about a plant or a paramecium or a person, they all do the same 4 jobs. They sense the environment, they analyze the information that's coming in, and then they affect a motor response. 4 things: sensing, analyzing, affecting, a movement. That's all life is. It's those 4 jobs. And the brain, there was a value added that natural selection was able to engineer to have organisms, vertebrates, to develop a separate organ, the brain, that did those 4 jobs for the organism. Interesting, right? That has a huge role to play in health and well-being and in illness. So what do we mean when we say the mind? The mind is really what the brain does to achieve what the brain is for, okay? The mind and consciousness, these are capacities, magical capacities, that evolve to help the brain do those 4 things, to help the brain sense the environment, analyze it, and affect a decision to move or not. Now, I have a question for all of you. Are you a mammal? Okay, I hope some of you are smiling, but you're all nodding yes.
Yes.
Yes, because that's really essential for understanding health and well-being. Because as this cladogram shows, this decision was made over 300 million years ago when mammals started to develop. And mammals discovered a survival strategy that is as important today as anything we can discuss when it comes to the human experience. And that survival strategy is social attachment. Okay, so think, what do we struggle with today? We struggle with something we call the social network, right? And why is Mark Zuckerberg a billionaire? Because he intuited that this is what human beings want. They want social connection. But where does that come from? It doesn't just come from thin air. No. Over 300 million years ago, the first mammals developed, and they discovered they had variations that allowed them to do a better job of surviving when they had parental and social attachment. Okay? And in order to do that, you need certain brain structures. You needed certain genes that could be appropriated to develop certain brain structures that would allow you to perfect that function of parental and social attachment. And this slide from Cass a few years ago shows you this stippled area. That's the cingulate cortex. You remember I mentioned the anterior cingulate and the mid-cingulate? I showed you that on an earlier slide. Well, that's the extraordinarily important cingulate cortex. And do you know that only mammals have that cortex? Reptiles don't have it, amphibians don't have it. And this is the part of your brain that helps you to do parental and social attachment. And this is the beautiful human brain, and this is the cingulate, the anterior cingulate and mid-cingulate. Okay? And here's that hippocampus I was telling you about. Here's the amygdala. And this part of your brain is going to communicate to the amygdala, we're safe. You don't have to produce these strong, persistent, overwhelming stress responses that are going to make us sick. But what's the meaning of safety for the human being? The meaning of safety, because of this story that I've just told you, is parental and social attachment that's coming from this region, which, as I've told you, connects here and tells that part of the brain, chill out. We're connected. We're socially attached. We're safe. Okay? We don't have to think about the future being separated from those we love and care about and who care for us. We don't have to think about the past mistakes we've made socially and with our parents or our children. At the moment, in the present, we are safe and attached. Now, this is a mentor of mine, a famous neuroscientist, neuroanatomist, who I spent a sabbatical with. His name is Paul MacLean. He wrote a classic book, The Triune Brain and Evolution. So he taught me a lot about brain evolution, not only of humans, but of lizards and birds and mammals. And he said to me, and he wrote to me in his book, good luck on my studies on the most painful mammalian condition, separation, exclamation point. So this is very, very important for all of medicine, because patients, when they get a signal that they might be ill, whether it's a pain in their tummy or whether it's, an ache in their left shoulder or arm, or whether it's a cough or persistent cough, or whether it's blood in their urine, what does that say? Of course, they're not physicians, but their brains tell them, their amygdalas tell them, oh my gosh, this may be serious. But when a human being says that, because of the evolutionary story we've just shared, you can think back to Paul, to Paul MacLean, because you now can put your finger on why all of our patients are so stressed out and worried. It's because the meaning behind those symptoms is the threat of separation. Okay, I'm going to move along. But this is a very important part of the evolutionary story. This is from the brilliant Marcel Messelam, a behavioral neurologist who is now retired, but he was the chair at Northwestern after being at Beth Israel here in Boston. And what he's pointing out here is that invertebrate brains, this is actually a rat brain, but invertebrate brains, there are these two ancient pathways. One is very dorsal or superficial. The other is ventral or inferior. And this dorsal one is actually called the hippocampocentric. It is one which helps the organism to understand where it is. This one, the ventral one, helps the organism to know what is around it. Well, it's now that you know the part of the story about separation and attachment and where it comes from in terms of how the brain evolved, you'll understand that in order for an organism to do a good job of making a decision about what to approach and what to avoid, it needs to know where it is in space. It needs to answer the where question, but it also needs to answer the what question, what is around it, in order to make that decision. And so where did these two ancient moieties meet up? They meet up here, which is here. This is the anterior cingulate. Very, very important part of your brain. So secure attachment becomes essential for a sense of solace, a sense of reduced stress, a sense of well-being, a sense of wellness, the ability to live a good life. And now you know where that all comes from. If you feel constantly threatened in terms of your attachments, if you fear that you're going to be separated from food, from sexual objects, from parental and social objects, or from your future goals, the future attachments you want to make, if you feel at threat of losing those attachments and being separated, that's where stress comes from. And the ramifications of that kind of stress, if it's allowed to persist, if it becomes strong enough and overwhelming enough, is something we call allostatic loading. Because allostasis is what your brain does to keep all of your physiologies, all of your hormonal axes, all of them in harmony, in what we call allostasis, stable even in the midst of environmental changes. But if you're constantly, if your attachments are under threat, then you spend a lot of metabolic energy. And this metabolic wear and tear is called allostatic loading. Now, one of the most tragic things for any human being is to be traumatized as a child during those periods when that prefrontal cortical area, the anterior cingulate and the medial prefrontal cortex, are being sculpted. So when you are 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, your brain is very plastic. The synapses are being formed, they're being pruned. And if you have been physically, emotionally, sexually abused as a child, those structures are weakened, and you will have a harder time managing your amygdala and feelings of threat, feelings of separation, anxiety, and obviously your ability to do attachment becomes challenged. And those insecure attachments can, unfortunately, in some people, lead to a lifetime of terrible stress and anxiety, and multiple stress-related chronic non-communicable diseases. Now, this slide, very quickly, I just wanted to show you the human being and human brains at work. This was in Florida in 2017, and a child got caught in a riptide, and one of the parents tried to save the child, but the parent also got caught in the riptide. And the people on shore had to figure out, how are we going to save them? So look what they did. All of those brains, all of those anterior cingulates, all of those millions of years of evolution really culminated in this effort to sense what was happening in the environment. Here are fellow human beings who are in the midst of the most terrible separation challenge, separation fear. These people on shore then had to analyze that sensory information, and then they had to affect a decision to move, to find an attachment solution for these suffering human beings. And so what did they do? They formed a human chain and they rescued them. I can't think of anything more metaphorical about today's talk and about mind-body medicine. It's very dramatic to me to see that. So I told you about trauma, and this slide gives you the neural circuitry. Here again is that amygdala, the hippocampus, medial prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate. And so what happens when you've experienced trauma? Well, first of all, this is what I was telling you. Your amygdala, when it feels a separation threat, is going to ignite all of these parts of the brain. And you're going to have a heart rate increase, blood pressure increase, perhaps ulcer symptoms, panting, respiratory distress, arousal, hypervigilance, startle response, sometimes freezing, and obviously a lot of cortisol is going to be released. But what happens if you're a resilient person? What happens if you've had a lifetime of secure attachment and these areas of your brain are strong? Well, you're going to be able to send messages from the medial prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, to the amygdala, and you're going to stimulate inhibitory neurons. These are intercalated GABA interneurons that can turn off the excitatory neurons in the central amygdala and thereby decrease the fear response and decrease the stress response. Pretty cool. Now, if you're in the midst of chronic stress, maybe you've had early trauma, you're going to be putting out lots of stress hormones and transmitters, and you're going to have immune dysfunction. You're going to be more prone to something we call a metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome has 4 stigmata. It has truncal obesity, it has hyperlipidemia, it has hypertension, and it has insulin receptors that are not very responsive to insulin, making you more susceptible to type 2 diabetes. And oxidative stress, really, and immunoactivation plays a large role in the development of metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is the foundation, really, for these chronic non-communicable diseases. Now, you may have genetic vulnerabilities that you start out with. Maybe it's serotonin transporter, or dopamine receptor genes, or brain-derived neurotropic factor genes, or glucocorticoid receptor genes, or catecholaminomethyltransferase genes, or neuropeptide Y genes. Neuropeptide Y, the more you have, actually makes you more resilient. But we all have a mosaic of genes that we've inherited. Sometimes we might think of this as the first hit if we have a particular problem with one of these important genes. But a second hit may be early life and environmental changes, and many of them are listed here, including attachment, maternal stress, nutritional problems, obstetric complications. We now know prenatal stressors, because the placenta of the mother, if the mother is psychosocially stressed, or has an infection, the placenta of that mother will have a robust inflammatory response, and the fetus will be exposed to a large amount of pro-inflammatory cytokines, which may affect the fetal brain development and lead downstream to health risks. And then later in life, you may have another separation challenge. And this may be determinative in whether you're resilient or whether you're vulnerable. And this slide I have up there, this is a recent, really provocative study from Mass General, from Ahmed Tawakal, a cardiologist, and Roger Pittman, psychiatrist, colleague of mine. And basically, they did a study looking at positron emission tomography combined with computerized tomography, PET CT scans. And they looked at total body PET CT scans. And they were able to show that people who were highly stressed on perceived stress scale and had activation of their amygdalas. But not only that, they had activation of their bone marrow. So their bone marrow started to overproduce these macrophages. And of course, more and more pro-inflammatory cytokines were produced. And the endothelium of the arteries started to develop inflammation, which also showed up on the PET CT scans. So this becomes a background for much of what we see in stress-related chronic non-communicable diseases, cardiovascular disease, stroke, etc., related to stress. And again, we see when we're talking about the pain signal, it's all felt in the anterior and cingulate and mid-cingulate. We talked about PTSD and the fact that the amygdala is hypercharged, and there's a difficult time extinguishing fear responses to the threat cues, and that's because the anterior cingulate is no longer robust, it's smaller, and that could be because of combat-related PTSD. It could also be because of adverse childhood experiences. Now, what's the public health meaning of all this? Well, look here. I mentioned that these are the biggest challenges of the 21st century in terms of disease burden. And we don't have any great answers for them. Primary care doctors do their best, and they're giving antihypertensives, they're giving anti-inflammatories, they're doing their best to try to keep people in decent shape, but many of these people succumb to those stress-related non-communicable diseases, and they're admitted and they're readmitted, and their quality of life is very poor. And not only that, the healthcare system is going broke because of these diseases and because we don't have any great answers. When we're talking about cardiovascular diseases, I mentioned, stroke, chronic pulmonary diseases, arthritides, autoimmune diseases, and importantly, neuropsychiatric diseases, which account for more than 30% of stress-related chronic non-communicable diseases. And I should make a point here that there's really very little difference in terms of the origination of these stress-related illnesses. The difference really resides in what your vulnerability is. So if I'm vulnerable to coronary artery disease and my stress is overwhelming and chronic, that's where it's going to get me. If I have the genetic vulnerability to major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or epilepsy, that's where chronic, overwhelming stress is going to show up. Okay? The cells in your body are not subject to the foolish stigma which continues to separate neuropsychiatric problems from garden variety medical problems. That should be clear to any thoughtful thinking person these days who has any understanding of biological truth. But the issue is that this is enormously expensive. And so the estimate is that these diseases cost the world $47 trillion, roughly 75% of the global GDP in 2010. These are figures from the Harvard School of Public Health and the World Economic Forum. And it's projected to grow. So this is a dire picture unless we do something about it. And so at the Benson Henry Institute, and we're very proud that we're becoming connected with the Boston Center of Excellence in Yoga and Ayurveda. Why? Because we believe in this equation. We've been talking about stress, and we can think about stress as a numerator in this equation. And my point of view is that stress really reflects evolutionarily the separation threats I've been arguing for. The denominator is resilience. And resilience really reflects the kind of attachment solutions like those people forming the human chain and saving the parent and the child and the riptide. That's human resiliency. And there are many factors involved in human resilience. First of all, we need to teach people how to elicit the opposite of the stress response physiology, something Dr. Herbert Benson, the founder and the director emeritus of our Benson Henry Institute, called the relaxation response. You know, he studied first studied transcendental meditators, and he was able to show that they had great success in reducing the stress response, reflected in reducing the blood pressure and heart rate and oxygen consumption. So finding a way to elicit relaxation response is very important because it reduces that numerator. Nowadays, we talk a lot about mindfulness, and mindfulness meditation is an important way to elicit relaxation response, and also to allow you to selectively attend in the present so that you're not worried about past separation events and you're not worried about future separation fears. Then social support. You all know why that's important now. You all nodded that you were mammals, right? So this means that in order for you to have a healthy brain and body, there has to be some sense of being securely attached. And that means you get benefit from social support, but you also get benefit because you're hardwired to be pro-social and to help others. And you get a physiological benefit from being pro-social as well. Cognitive skills. That prefrontal part of your brain can develop positive sort of cognitive skills. Many of us generate our own internal stress. We're negative thinkers. So we go through our day, our week, our month, and we can't shake the idea that we've made lots of mistakes and things that have gone wrong are completely our fault. That creates this cauldron of stress within us. So we have to teach people how to do cognitive behavioral therapy with themselves to reduce that habit of negative thinking. Positive psychology, optimism, purpose, meaning, forgiveness, gratefulness. That's an important part of human resilience.
Dr.
Spiritual,
Fricchione,
yes,
to interrupt, um, we have a little time left, and
okay,
many questions are coming. So
I'll
requesting
speed it up.
to finish your presentation, and then there are many quite interesting questions coming.
Okay, very good. So also involved is exercise and mindful exercise, and this is where yoga is important. And then in terms of Ayush and Ayurveda, nutrition, low glycemic diet, good sleep hygiene, and healthy habits. And we'll finish up. There are a lot of wonderful stretching exercises. So yoga may lower your vulnerability to non-communicable diseases by bumping up your parasympathetic activation, reducing your sympathetic activation, reducing perceived stress, and through the massage, the musculoskeletal massage, you may be changing stromal activation and changing inflammatory cell activation, which can have benefits for your physiology. And we do know that heart rate variability, which is a reflection of parasympathetic tone, increases, blood pressure decreases, heart rate can decrease, baroreflex sensitivity is decreased, inflammatory cytokines, sleep, etc. So these are postulates about how yoga might be especially helpful. And there are studies that show you can reduce oxidative stress with mindful exercise like yoga. You can reduce depression, anxiety, etc. Mindfulness is important. This slide shows you that mindful meditation can actually reduce amygdala response to threat. You can change the genes that are activated through yoga, as well as through meditation. And part of what you change is you can reduce the acute inflammatory response genes. You can change structure over time as a meditator. And you can affect positively all of these chronic non-communicable diseases. So we need to do a better job of instilling this into our healthcare system. And you see here on the right, primary and secondary prevention. That's where yoga, meditation, mind-body approaches really needs to be stepped up if we're going to do battle with non-communicable diseases. So stress-related non-communicable diseases are the most significant challenges. Yoga and meditation are safe, inexpensive, adjunctive approaches. They can help us address this public health crisis. But research needs to be more methodologically rigorous before these complementary approaches are going to be more widely accepted. Now, the Swami said, whosoever comes to me through whatsoever form, I reach him, struggling through paths which in the end lead to me. That was the key thing. He sounds like obviously a brilliant man who understood that people were going to find different ways, different meditative approaches, different religious and philosophical approaches to reach harmony and peace and to stay away from dissension. So healing really is helping one another meet the separation challenges of life. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fricchione. That was wonderful, and I have learned so many things, and I'm sure the audience is. So there are a few questions came. First, I'll start with a comment. I'll basically read it out for you. Your screen is too small. You may not be able to see it. So one comment came from Nancy Cellini. She says that just a comment so powerful on the visual of the human chain. Gosh, we need those more than ever. Thank you.
Good.
Then she asked a question from your comment from earlier of the presentation. You noted glutathione. What is your thought on supplements and under what conditions should we be supplementing? That was Nancy's question.
Yes, yes. Well, I have to plead some ignorance because I'm not an expert in Ayurveda, and so I think you're going to have a talk from Manoj Pasan, who's and others who are more expert in that. I do think that this is an important area for research. So just one thing, there are receptors for advanced glycation end products. They're called RAGEs. And high glycemic diet, for example, will affect those receptors. And when you look at the downstream effects in the cell, intracellularly, and second messengers and so on, you will actually affect through a different pathway, enhancing the inflammatory response. So this is one reason why in truncal obesity, for example, people who are overweight and obese actually become self-producers of their own inflammation. And that's one reason. So in terms of supplements, this is a tough area because the oxidative stress, one thing we know about the mitochondria is that we need to know, we don't know enough about processes like mitohormesis. Mitohormesis is this process where some stress actually helps the mitochondria perform more efficiently. Interesting, right? There's actually an inverted U-shaped curve for mitochondrial activity. I showed you that inverted U for how the brain responds to stress. Well, in mitochondria as well, some stress is important. So, some oxidative stress actually helps the cell, and reactive oxygen species help the cell perform. So we are still at a rather unsophisticated stage in learning how to manipulate mitochondrial health. And my sense is that we're still at a stage where, when I go to CVS, for example, there's usually 2 aisles filled with vitamins and supplements and so on. We just don't know enough yet, or at least I don't know enough. And I think my sense, though, is that this should be an area of more active, high-quality research going forward.
Thank you. Next question is from Bill Christo. Bill is saying, is the hippocampus a brake and amygdala an accelerator?
Well, that's a very good way to think about it. The hippocampus and amygdala are these ancient structures. In organisms, and I may sound chauvinistic here, I don't mean to, in lower organisms, where the amygdala was balanced against hippocampus and some other parts of the limbic system and paralimbic system, so that these lower vertebrates did have ways to try to shut down the amygdala as best they could. So the hippocampus can be thought of in some respects as being a bit of a brake to the amygdala. But it became clear in evolutionary time that natural selection, through mutation, through the development of new brain structure, was able to do a more sophisticated, more enhanced job of dampening amygdala tone. So that's an important thing. I didn't get into another very interesting area, which is the evolution of the autonomic nervous system. So there you have, I'm reminded by the use of the term brake and accelerator, that when you think about the evolution of the autonomic nervous system, Stephen Porges, who set out this hypothesis, believes that we kind of started with one defensive posture, which was the freeze response when we had a separation threat. And that's a very primitive vagal response, parasympathetic response. Then the sympathetic nervous system evolved, which gave us an accelerator. We could flee or fight when we had a separation threat. But then there was a sophisticated ventral vagal complex, which allowed us to have another kind of defense, a very sophisticated defense, which really was just lifting our foot off of the accelerator in a more subtle way. So that's what allows me, according to Dr. Porges, it allows me to produce my facial affect and my gesticulations and so on. I need some sympathetic tone, but I also have the ventral vagal complex, which is keeping me and my sympathetic nervous system under some control. So that's another example of the brake accelerator approach. But yes, hippocampus did perform a bit of a braking function on the amygdala and still does.
There is another question came. I'm trying to get the question. Give me 1 second. So Dr. Anand Venkatraman, I think you may know him. He's a neurologist at the Mass General Hospital.
Mm-hmm.
His question is, given the extreme complexity of the brain and body, do you think subjective first-person methods like meditation are always going to be superior to third-person approaches such as medications, surgery, in addressing complex diseases like stress?
Thank you. That's a very good question. And I think the way I'd choose to answer it is that as someone who's kind of toward the end of my career, I was raised in a medical system where medicine was seen as being purely reactive. And what do I mean by that? My training at these wonderful hospitals was, okay, we're here to try our best to save or to care for people who have reached the stage of the worst illnesses imaginable, right? They may be on their third MI, or they may have metastatic cancer, or they may be undergoing dialysis, or they may have, we may be amputating their foot and then doing a BKA and then an AKA because they're diabetes, et cetera, right? Or we're taking care of them post-stroke. And that's what a lot of us doctors of my vintage have spent our lives dealing with. And it's, I think, dawning on us that we really need to learn from the ancients about what goes into a good life and what allows people to live these precious lives that they've been given in as much health as possible. And I think we're always going to need doctors to do the reactive medicine, but we doctors, because we know a lot about the body and the brain and how they function, need to take that knowledge and we need to go way upstream, and we need to do our best to impart that information about this wonderful, beautiful thing we call the human body, and do proactive medicine. And that means that kind of first person self-care, self-knowledge about the body and physiology. And so that, I think, becomes part of our job description. And I think that's what the doctor is referring to. There's something very effective about getting to people when they're healthy and trying to give them the information they need to stay healthy. And then certainly those of us who have risk factors need to pay special attention to that equation. Stress is the numerator, resilience is the denominator. And as we flesh out, because that equation, when you think about it in terms of behavior, it becomes separation challenges and attachment solutions. And so, there's a whole field of psychiatry called object relations theory and attachment theory. John Bowlby, the brilliant English psychiatrist, so on that level, that kind of meta language of attachment theory, you can build the same equation, right? But then at every level, that equation becomes important. So you can talk about mitochondrial separation challenges and mitochondrial attachment solutions. So the point is that yes, that first person, getting people to understand there are these enjoyable ways to stay healthy, as healthy as they can be. We're always going to need physicians to take care of you when you have acute illness and are suffering. But physicians also need to be there to learn more about the healthy state and what keeps people healthy. And part of that knowledge is what we've talked about today. How to deal with stress and resilience, and by doing so to reduce vulnerability. And that's where meditation, mind-body approaches, yoga, mindful exercise has a real role to play. And that's the wisdom of the ages. When they didn't have anything to provide reactively when people got really sick, they spent a lot of time doing the kind of proactive health approaches.
Dr. Narendra Bhalotkar, he's a senior cardiologist in New York. He has a couple of questions. First, he says, I mean, it relates to what comments you just made. He says, with overwhelming feeling and doing better experience of yoga doers, do we need research studies?
Yeah, obviously yoga's been around a long time, and it's been around a long time without research studies, because people feel better. I'm certainly not an expert yoga doer, but the times I've done it, my wife and I do it. I especially like the meditation at the end, and so it's something very special about yoga. And I'm sure I would have that special feeling even if I didn't know a little bit about the research into yoga. But one of the challenges for a place like the Boston Center of Excellence is going to be dealing with the coin of the realm in Western society. The coin of the realm is allopathic Western research medicine. I mean, I'm privileged to be at Massachusetts General Hospital, which is really the world's greatest research hospital. Certainly, it would be disingenuous of me not to sort of get excited about research into things like yoga and the kind of research we do at the Benson Henry Institute, because I guess that's the way I've been raised. But I certainly can understand that people don't need to have a randomized controlled trial every time they want to get the benefits of the yoga experience.
So he has a Dr. Valotkar has a follow-up question.
Yes.
So having said that, about the research, are they easy to conduct with it being difficult to standardize those response and measure over what period of time?
Yeah. Well, you know, there is um, um, the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health has an interest in yoga, and we have finished recruitment and we're analyzing data on a big study from NCCIH on yoga matched with um, a meditative approach, so a kind of mindful exercise versus meditation, with a whole host of biomarkers and psychometrics and neuroimaging and gene expression and so on. So it'll be interesting to see what's similar and what's different about yoga and its version of mindful exercise. And this was a Vipassana sort of yoga approach, and a meditative, focused awareness meditation. So it is always expensive to do longitudinal research, and this is one of the problems in our field. So I thank the doctor for bringing that up, because you know the topic of our conversation today was these chronic stress-related non-communicable diseases. And if you want to get your point across in a public health way, you need large numbers, big N, and you need a longitudinal study. And those are very expensive. And, you know, at least we haven't been successful in getting a large grant to do a real long-term study. But I do think that, you know, and of course, our country is going through a convulsion now in terms of what kind of healthcare system we want. But there was a moment there with Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act when people started to wake up to this argument of reactive medicine and proactive medicine, and they sort of said we have to incentivize being proactive and trying to do health promotion and illness prevention. And you know, hopefully that will come back, and perhaps that there will be health system studies that want to look at enrollees with large numbers and what something like chronic use of yoga can do to the health of a population. So I think that that'll be important to keep our eyes on.
Thank you. And I just have exactly a couple of minutes left. I will take one last question from I'm just going through the number questions. It's a very small screen. So Bill Christo, who asked earlier asked a question. He's a one second, I cannot get to that point. He's a doctor. I'm a doctor of public health and a yoga teacher therapist. Can we have a follow-up discussion about research plus yoga therapy? I attended Harvard Symposium last year, but we need more focus on yoga as an intervention. Thoughts on this? What role can yoga therapists? Oh, that's another question from Nancy. Yoga therapists play in future. What's your view? So with these two last questions, we'll end. We will not take any more questions. So Dr. Fricchione.
Well, I think if I was to try to take both questions at once, that there is going to be a role for yoga therapists to take an active role in research, and but this is one of the challenges. And certainly, Kanchan, you know, trying to get the funding to do this kind of research is not easy. And perhaps if there is a groundswell of support from people who have felt the benefits of yoga and want it to be scientifically shown in order to make it more popularly available, then I think there'll be a lot of opportunity for yoga practitioners to get involved in multi-site studies, because one thing it might be important for us to learn more about community yoga. There's one thing to do it in our setting, for example, in an academic medical center, but it would be kind of interesting to see the health effects of community yoga. So these are, I think, important questions for the future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fricchione. It was a wonderful, lot of new ideas, and I think as a Boston Center of Excellence, we are going to work with you and other institutes. Hopefully, funding will come and a lot of support will come from different sources. And with that, we will end today. And we want to thank every participant for taking time this Saturday afternoon. And we will announce the next speaker soon. And if you want to have I think someone was asking Dr. Fricchione if the slides could be shared. If you give permission, then we can send it to the participants.
Okay. I think that'll be fine. I just have to make sure that there are not any slides that I haven't gotten permission to share. I'll be in touch with you, Kanchan.
Okay. All right. Thank you again. Have a great afternoon and evening, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.